Baltimore and WNST.net. You know, the tragic loss of Muhammad Ali over the weekend, and I think it was a tragedy over the last quarter of a century, as we've talked about. So many issues around the man and the politics and the boxing and the media and the children and the charity and the disease of Parkinson's. But I got a guy here who remembers it all very well, and he's one of our favorite guests to have on. He's a true Marylander here from Baltimore, Maryland, and he remembers all things the greatest. We welcome the one and the only Frank DeFord back onto the program. Long time at Sports Illustrated, still on NPR, and I still enjoy his work on Real Sports with Brian Gumbel from time to time. Mr. DeFord, always a pleasure to have you on the program. I hear you came to Baltimore for a crab cake or two a few weeks ago, did you not?
I was at the Enoch Pratt Library talking about my notebook, which is a collection of my favorite NPR pieces, and called I'd Know That Voice Anywhere.
So it says here, discusses everything from sex scandals to steroids to Americans' perennial nostalgia for Joe DiMaggio and why, and a culture dominated by celebrity. Wouldn't that be what Muhammad Ali, I mean, the culture dominated by celebrity, he may stand at the top of all of the kings of modern-day athletes, movie stars, actors, the whole gamut.
There's no question that he was in the forefront of what we call trash talking, and was a much more boastful athlete than we had been prepared for at that time. And he was one of a kind, Muhammad, and he certainly stirred things up when he appeared on the scene.
Well, I mean, as far as contemporaries and your work at Sports Illustrated and in the sports media space, and Howard Cosell was also a contemporary of yours, the playoff from the media to the athlete and how we treat athletes these days and what we want from athletes. We want athletes as people who fill up notebooks to say controversial, important, significant things, and they all sort of pale in comparison to the fights that Ali fought and certainly the platform and the era from which he fought.
Well, it's also true that his most, famous episode was refusing to be inducted. Well, of course, you can't ask athletes to deal with that today because there's no longer a draft, and he came along at a time, the 1960s. Which we all know was a time of turmoil and controversy, tremendous upheaval, racial, political, in so many ways. And so he was there at the right moment in history for the sort of person that he was.
Okay, so when you were writing and talking about him, obviously it was on the tip of your tongue all the time, being in the sports space during the 60s. What were your feelings about it then, and what are your feelings about it now 50 years later as to what he represented? I'm sure there was a time in the mid-60s when you thought he may go to jail, he may never fight again, he may never be heard from again, but sort of like Elvis, he really rose from the ashes of all that in the 70s to become even larger than he was in the 60s as an Olympic champion, right?
Well, he's a very complicated guy, and I think that I understood that early on. I met him before he was champion, and I'm not so sure that he was as intellectual as he's been sometimes painted, but he certainly was street smart. I always understood that he stood up for what he believed in. That was obvious from the very beginning when he made the switch from Christianity to Islam. And I don't think that my opinion changed much of Ali over the years. I did see, we all did later on, a certain cruel streak in him, which hadn't been there or had not been evident originally. He was very insulting to Jill Fraser and to Floyd Patterson, and there was a bit of meanness to him, but none of us are without flaws, and I think overall there's no question that he was a strong advocate for what he believed, and a great, and of course it goes without saying, a great athlete.
Well, my wife and I had a chat about this because the HBO piece, and I know you do a lot of work at HBO. A couple of years ago, the Ali Frazier story came out, and the Thrill of Manila, and all that. And my wife was obviously very turned off, I think, as any thinking person would be, by the racism, the Uncle Tom, the white man versus the black man, and all of that. But in that era, they were selling tickets, right? And this was an era of closed-circuit television, which really had never been heard of before, right? We didn't pay to watch a man walk on the moon, right? We didn't pay to see things like that, and maybe Billie Jean King and Riggs in that era and whatnot. But the pay-per-view boxing, you needed a draw like Ali, and he needed to sell tickets, and part of that was a platform to sell tickets in some way, was it not?
Well, of course it was. It also was part of the downfall of boxing, that if you put all the good things, the good fights, the best fights, if you put them behind a paywall, you're going to limit your audience. And it's important to remember that boxing was an important sport when Ali was the champion. It isn't any longer. I mean, it's a fringe sport. Most people, myself included, couldn't tell you who the heavyweight champion of the world is. It used to be that the heavyweight champion of the world was probably the most famous athlete in the world. They always said Ali was the most famous person in the world, but I'm not so sure that Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano didn't hold the same sort of position. So that pay-per-view for boxing made a lot of money for some people, but it also ultimately was very damaging to the sport.
We are chatting with Frank DeFord, the legendary Frank DeFord. He has a new book out, was here in Baltimore a few weeks ago down at Enoch Pratt. I actually reached to Mr. DeFord about a month ago and forgot, and he came through town, so we'll promote his book here as well as the NPR and the HBO. I Know That Voice Anywhere is the Frank DeFord book, and we're talking about Muhammad Ali. As a writer, Frank, and on Saturday when he passed, during the day, out on Twitter, out in social media, all of the links, whether it was Hunter S. Thompson or Mark Cram, whether it was a short story, a long story. My dear friend Alan Goldstein from the Baltimore Sun had written a book. All of that was sort of linked out there. But more than that, there was this notion that folks like you, great writers, woke up on Saturday, saw the passing of Muhammad Ali, and maybe without assignment or without getting paid, or they just wanted to write, whether it was a tribute, a criticism, an obituary, a profile, they had something on their mind they wanted to say. I read some of the most eloquent, off-the-cuff, very quick writing on Saturday and Sunday because everyone chimed in with seemingly a different angle on Ali, right?
Well, the only thing is, and I agree with you, but it's also true that nothing really has changed in the last 20 or 25 years since the disease overtook him. And so many of the subjects dealing with him have been dealt with numerous times over these years. The whole business about his switch in religion, the induction, the great fights, the Thrill in Manila, and so forth, all of that has been discussed. He's been very, very diminished for a long time, and we really haven't seen much of him during that period. So that there wasn't a whole lot new to say about Muhammad. So much of the tributes to him could have been written 20 years ago.
Well, and I think that one of the interesting parts of him, and as a writer, there's a sort of a Shakespearean quality here, right? I mean, there's a real tragedy at the end that this guy that made his living with his fist and with his mouth, the fist cost him his mouth later in life. In the last 25 years, as you pointed out, he rarely spoke and couldn't speak and couldn't come out. As a storyteller, what a life, huh? I mean, and what an end of a life, and what a tragedy in that way, right?
Well, of course, anybody who suffers what he did for so long is tragic. All the more so that indisputably the reason that he had the problems that he did was because he'd been a boxer. I mean, he was bludgeoned. He was self-damaged, if you will, and that makes it even more tragic. What made him great is ultimately what killed him, and there is a tragedy to that, a Shakespearean tragedy to that. It's theater, and it's a shame because he was such an interesting personality. Of course, he lived 74 years. He didn't die like some athletes at a very young age. He lived a very full life, and I think as much as possible, his life in those last terrible years was nonetheless happy. He was happily married. Lonnie took good care of him, unlike a lot of fighters in the past. He had plenty of money. So he lived as well as he could, given his limited circumstances.
How well did you know him, and how many of the fights did you cover, attend? I mean, were you at Ali Frazier one? Did you get on a plane and fly to Africa and fly to the Philippines?
No. You see, I didn't personally cover boxing, so that was left to the boxing writers. I did see him on a number of occasions, not covering him, and I, as a matter of fact, I saw him when he first became champion, when he beat Sonny Liston, and I believe, 1964?
Correct.
I saw that fight, and I knew him away from the ring. I certainly can't pretend to say that I knew Muhammad well, but we certainly knew each other and had some very pleasant times together, as a matter of fact. I remember one evening in New York, about 5 or 6 of us were having dinner, and again, this was when he was starting to really falter. His head just leaned over, and he went to sleep on my wife's shoulder.
Wow!
right at the dinner table. I think part of that was that he no longer could participate, so everybody else was chatting and so forth, and he, couldn't really talk. And I think for someone who had been such an energetic speaker through the years, he got bored.
Is there a part in watching him die the way he did and deteriorate that unto itself he was an advertisement for why not to box, right, in the end? One of the reasons boxing has fallen apart is you've seen this,
That through the years, I mean, we've been talking about boxers. The old expression was Queer Street. He walked down Queer Street, and they were all battered. Punch drunk is another expression. And yes, some fighters got away with it in the same way that some people smoked 3 packs of cigarettes and lived to the age of 90. But yes, that as famous as he was and as wealthy as he was and as great as he was an athlete, it's also true that he was an advertisement for the horrors of boxing.
Tell me about your book and what you did here in Baltimore and coming through. I know how much you love the area and you come home from time to time. It's always, it's always good to say Frank DeFord's from Baltimore. We like that you're from here, Mr. DeFord.
Well, I just came down there and just as you said, to promote the book, I spoke at Enoch Pratt, and it is always a pleasure for me to come back to Baltimore, and I hope I've got enough friends there that I can sell a few more books in Baltimore than I can other places. But the book is I've been doing commentaries for NPR since 1980, more than 1,600 of them. Whoa! And I selected about 100 of them as my favorites, trying to get variety, not necessarily the best ones, but trying to get some variety, some provocative, some humorous. And so it's a collection of all those years, as seen through my eyes on the Wednesday mornings that I was on NPR.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I hope you're doing well, health is well, life is happy. Things are good for you, Mr. DeFord.
Well, yeah, and the Orioles are in first place.
There you go. That's all you need to know. That means happiness in June, and the humidity's low.
There you go.
Hey,
what more can you ask for?
Hey, man, we'll get you down ashore and get you some crab cakes and some corn next time you're down here. I'm really sorry I missed you. The Enoch Pratt Library is about 10 blocks from my house. Nice to know they still have libraries, right?
They still have libraries, and they still matter a great deal.
Well, it's great having you on. Thank you very much for your incredible memories.
I enjoyed it.
You're always great with us. Appreciate you. There he goes, Mr. Frank DeFord, one of the senior statesmen here, and a guy who was at the Ali Liston fight. Who knew that I would get that going there this week? And Mr. DeFord, obviously, the book is I'd Know That Voice Anywhere, and you could Google Frank DeFord and learn about his 18 books and his incredible 50 years of journalism and sports writing and laying the groundwork for guys like me to do the things that we do around here. So really nice of Frank to join us here. You can find me out in the Bayou Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. You can download the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from wherever you happen to be. And, of course, any breaking news happens first on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by our friends at Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports. 2. Welcome back. WNST Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.